Good afternoon and welcome to Leveraging Crisis as a Springboard for Action and Innovation. I am Tiffany Marley, Vice President for Practice Transformation at the National Community Action Partnership. And on behalf of everyone in our office, we would like to welcome you to today's presentation as we engage in this conversation and webinar today. We would like to invite everyone to ground yourselves in the promise of community action, which says community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. With that said, I want to also mention that today's conversation is really an output or an expression of the work of the Learning Communities Resource Center, which really aims to build our network's capacity to fight both the causes and the conditions of poverty more effectively. And through our Learning Communities Resource Center, over the course of the last several years, we've had an opportunity to facilitate learning community groups or cohorts focused on various innovations. And as those agencies have done the work of learning and testing what works as it relates to the various innovations, we have also had an opportunity to curate those lessons learned, curate resources, and it is always our intention to share with you what we have learned through our work through the what we call the LCRC. Additionally, today's webinar also connects to some special work that has taken place through our what we call our Community Action Economic Mobility Initiative. And we're pleased to have joining with us really one of our seasoned leaders, seasoned voices in our network, Mr. Dwayne Yoder. Dwayne is the president of Garrett County, the Garrett County Community Action Committee. I should know that because I've said it so many times. Located in Oakland, Maryland. And what I would like to say about Dwayne is he's been around our network for a long time and certainly has lots of stories and experiences that he could highlight to back up that important experience that he's had. And I regard him as one who is always open and generous in terms of sharing wisdom and resources to colleagues across this network. And today is no exception as it relates to our webinar today. So Dwayne, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Tiffany. As always, you're too kind. And I would just say one thing. One of the things that I miss greatly, and one of the things that I enjoy more than almost anything, is that opportunity to get together in person and share ideas informally, because it is a give and take, and we all learn. So I really appreciate the network. As a network of a learning community network, I do miss the opportunity for the informal give and take that we always had when we had our in-person meetings and conferences. But Tiffany, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. And just to give folks a bit of background, as we know, our country and our world is in a moment, to say the least, as it relates to the impacts of the COVID-19 virus and the impacts of this pandemic on the general health and well-being, really, I would say health, well-being, and even social realities for several of us around this country. And the impacts of that have had significant economic implications. It's safe to say that we have entered into an economic downturn, an economic recession. In anticipation of that, back in the spring, our government identified resources, the CARES funding, and basically dispatched those resources to various entities within the American infrastructure. And one of those entities being the Community Action Network, because it is the case that historically, really the truth is that we are legislatively mandated to be those first responders on the community level when things go wrong, when crisis happens, whether it's economic downturn or natural disaster, et cetera. And so this moment has not been different for us, and probably everybody on this call has a story about about significant impacts that have played out for you, for your customers, for your communities. And today we asked Dwayne to come and speak to us in this particular moment, to speak to us in this moment of crisis, and to really inspire those of us who have joined in on today's conversation to not just be so focused in crisis mode or the moment, but to really utilize this moment of crisis as an opportunity for innovation. And so with that said, Dwayne, it was in 2008 that the economy crashed and our country, it found itself in a recession. At that time in 2008, the government's response was ARRA, or the American Response and Recovery Act. I think I got that right. Y'all correct me if I'm wrong. Can you talk a little bit about what Garrett did to respond to that moment? Can you just give us a historical perspective?
Well, Tiffany, you said it so well when you said that one of the central roles of community action in our country is to be that front line, that local entity that has a built-in capacity to respond to whatever the crisis of the moment is. And certainly that recession, the Great Recession that you described, was one of those. And one of the things that I always thought that crises and risk and problems always do create opportunities, and the community services block grant, of course, is all about building that local capacity. So when ARRA happened, one of the things that we wanted to make sure is that unusually, I mean, different from many cases, we got a chunk of money from Csvg, and it was not planned. It came unexpectedly, and we had an opportunity in terms of how we wanted to make that work for us within the framework and the purpose of the Community Services Block Grant, the anti-poverty mission that grew out of our roots and the history of OEO and so on. So one of the things that our leadership team and our board here at Garrett County, and we're a small rural community, but one of the things that we talked about was to say, well, how can we use this one-time opportunity when money comes? We have an immediate crisis. We need to respond. We have issues that low-income families in our community are confronted with, and we have to respond to that. But how can we use this so that when we come out of this organization is even stronger and able to respond to the next time when we're needed? And so that was the key question. And at the time, we had just started, and we're in the middle really of completing a new strategic plan. And one of the things that had been coming out of that discussion was that we had repeatedly talked about how do we really know that we are fulfilling our mission. I mean, we had lots of programs and we had lots of numbers and we could produce a lot of outputs, and we were meeting our various grant requirements, but was there a way of really saying our families in more stable living conditions and more economically secure. And that was a question that we had a difficult time answering within our own organization. So when ARRA happened at almost the same time, it provided at least in our mind, a opportunity to try to answer those questions, because we had some money that we didn't have before, and it was money that had enough flexibility that allowed us to think that through those questions. And so what happened really was that that ARRA money, which was significant, at least in our arena, became the money that we used to finish the strategic plan and then implement it, to make sure that what we had in our strategic plan was something that wasn't just put on the shelf, but was implemented. And so, having said that, then I can start talking about the story about what that actually looked like, and I will, unless you stop me, Tiffany, and
Yeah, please tell us a little bit more about what that actually looked like. What happened?
Yeah. Well, the various stakeholders we had, whether it was the participants in our program, or whether it was our partners in the community, and whether it was our staff, our employees at Community Action, almost universally said, we didn't know that Community Action did all these things and had all these services. And it started me, and it started the board, and it started other people to think about how can we make sure that everything we're doing is focused on the family. It's centered on the family. It's centered on the outcomes that the families identified, centered on what they want to achieve. And that then led to a whole refocus on saying, how do we structure our organization? How do we structure our employees? What kind of jobs do we do? What kind of job descriptions do we have? What kind of communication systems do we have in place? What kind of leadership is being provided to make sure that this all gets implemented? That was all that had a cost associated with it. And so some of the very first things that we looked at doing was saying, well, let's think about what the outcomes are that we want to track, and let's think about how we can make sure that our entire organization is focused on those outcomes. And one of the things that led to specifically was the design and development of a universal intake. It led to at the time when we had computers, but they were ranging from 1-year-old to 15 years old, and so the tail was wagging the dog at times in terms of our technology. So we went through a process where we identified both hardware, software, and invested in that using our money. We went through a process where we said we have to make sure that staff is trained and continued to be trained. But one of the things that what grew out of that was kind of saying, well, the way we were doing business, we had to change the way we were doing business, and that became a organizational culture issue. So we had to change the culture of the organization. And one of the things that ARRA did that was, I think, particularly helpful was we said, well, as we get through this, let's take a full year and just test ideas. Let's take a dozen families and test our ideas on how we're integrating services, how we want to change the way we do businesses, how we want to track outcomes, and work with those families to do that. And we're going to take one person from every department, and they're going to be a team, and we're going to work on that. And we had some pushback from directors. We were taking staff away from their programs, and they were saying, well, are we losing supervisory control? Are we, who's paying for them? We used ARRA money to say to every director that we will help you pay for that staff time that you are losing to this team that we had developed. And we spent a year looking at what we thought we needed to do to change as an organization. And interestingly enough, and not really surprisingly, as we got into it, the directors, all our department directors, and when I say directors, I'm talking about department directors like our early childhood programs and our housing services and asset building programs. They came on board, but initially this ARRA money was the entree to paying for some of those questions and figuring out a way to pay for some of those questions that were being raised. So at the end of the day, I mean, this was a couple years process, as you know, and as a result of all that, we ended up with I think a different kind of organization that looked at outcomes, that integrated services, and that launched the whole family approach that we're using. At the time, everyone was calling it 2G, and caught the interest of a couple of the intermediaries and foundations in the country, the Annie A. Casey Foundation, the Aspen Institute. Those were groups that were interested in what we were doing as a result of the work that had been supported through ARRA. And today we've been working now for a number of years, of course, on the whole family approach, and it's changed the way we do business. It's built a capacity that we would have not otherwise had. It came out of the crisis of that economic recession that we were experiencing back in 2008, 9, so it really did make some significant changes. I would have to say, there were some ideas that didn't work out. And we had, one of the things that we thought we had nailed down and we're going to do is we were going to create a business that looked at our outdoor adventure sports ventures as a forum, a platform for doing leadership development training. And we actually created a business to start that. It didn't work too well in terms of the bottom line, that is. The college picked it up, the community college picked it up, and they now have a degree program built around that, and they do leadership development training around it. But the point of the matter was that it was really important for us to come out of that saying, one, we did respond to that recession. We did tap into resources that allowed us to respond to individual needs that families had. But at the end of the day, we came out of it as an organization that had changed, and I thought was much stronger, and has led to our ability to respond today in a different world, in a different crisis, in ways that we would have never done if we'd have just used that money for direct services.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Dwayne. So what I hear you saying is that moment, that Great Recession moment, really presented Garrett with a special opportunity, and an opportunity where you as an organization were asking some very deep questions around what difference you were making for your customers and how you might do that better. And ultimately that led to what I think I heard you say was a strategic planning process that then had implications on considerations around how your organization did business, which then led to an integrated services strategy, and then now what you call the 2-generation approach. And in that process, because it really had to do with the way in which your organization does business, it led to transformation or changes in terms of the way that you thought about technology, the way that you thought about your partnerships within the community, the ways in which you envisioned your staff, so your staff configuration. I think I heard you say that there was a transformation in terms of positions and the organizational culture, its structure, and then your general business practices. So that sounds like a whole lot that you all were able to achieve. And
one thing I should say, Tiffany, and this is another thing that ARRA supported, the Recovery Act supported, that was, I think, critical in our case anyway. And different agencies are at different points and have different approaches. So this is just our story. But we were serious about implementing the strategic plan. And that did involve changing every job description, and it did involve restructuring the agency and organizing it around our strategic objectives. But we had to have a means to make sure that happened. And one of the things that this allowed us to do, the person who had been facilitating our strategic planning, was a consultant at the time, was available to join the agency as an employee, and she became our vice president for strategic initiatives. And her job was to make sure that this happens. And so she watched that. She made sure that every work group that we had organized around every one of these tasks that we had organized met, and that the information was documented, and that we responded. She was, a critical part to this. And one of the things that I think is, for us at least, that was central to our ability to make this shift, is to have a person dedicated almost completely to implementation of those strategic objectives and that we had on board. I would have not had the capacity to do that or the time to do that. And so that's one of the elements that I think was critical to our success as well. But you're right, the organization changed dramatically over a 3-year period as a result of this.
Thank you, Dwayne. And so that sounds just very fascinating. So congratulations then on all that Garrett was able to achieve. I know I have a burning question related to all that. So the truth is, like in that moment or in that era, there was still crisis taking place. So there were some pretty urgent needs that your customers needed to be met. And can you maybe share a bit of insight for your colleagues here in the webinar today about like how you found the balance? So how did Garrett find an ability to dream big dreams about the future that could, sustain the well-being of your customers for the long haul, while at the same time meet those very urgent, pressing, immediate needs?
Well, and it was kind of interesting in comparison today to that period of time when ARRA was there. In a way, the pressing needs, the urgent needs that we're confronted with today, I think there just seemed to be a greater urgency today than what we were facing back then. But that we had, the whole point of the matter is that we wanted to have the capacity at the agency level to access those resources that allowed us to respond to those urgent needs. So if you remember correctly, way back in the ARRA days, when you had this huge influx of weatherization money, for instance, and does anyone remember that FERC, the alternative energy or the renewable energy program that came out of DOE? So we were, we were using all those resources, all those programs, and I can remember specifically that there was a set aside special money for housing development using the tax credit program that came out of ARRA specifically. There was new resources for broadband expansion in rural communities, and so the idea was that you needed to have the in-house capacity to access those resources. And so we weren't going to use the Csvg money that came under ARRA for those direct services, but that didn't mean that we weren't focused on getting those resources that allowed us to respond directly to needs that families had where they were confronting at that point in time. And I had this argument yesterday with our CDBG director at the state level, non-entitlement. And I was arguing with her about why doesn't the state allow indirect rates with CDBG? And she said, well, because we want strong projects, and if we take that money away from the projects won't be strong. Well, the point of the matter is she wasn't going to get strong projects if you don't have capacity at the local level. And so that just kind of demonstrates the whole point of saying, well, if you have good capacity, you can get those resources and your other ways to respond to those needs. And that's what our focus was.
So, Dwayne, I kind of heard you sort of pushing us forward a little bit. So like we've spent some time sort of thinking about that unique moment that started around 2008 and around ARRA. Can you now take us forward into the future, as it were, for sure, as we think about the economic downturn in particular, some of the issues or some of the themes that surfaced then certainly resonate with some of the issues and themes that we are facing right now. And like as you now sort of place yourself, in this moment, And this era, can you maybe talk a little bit about what you would say are maybe some of the lessons learned that you've kind of brought into this moment? And then tell us another story, would you, around what is currently on Garrett's mind around how you're going to leverage this current moment, or what are you doing in the face of this current moment? Give us some
Well,
insight.
Tiffany, let me just talk a little bit about, I mean, and this is not too different. I mean, I think this is this is an experience shared by a lot of community action agencies, most of them. But, we're looking at a situation today where I think we have some really large problems around, for example, the isolation. Families, individual elderly people are isolated. They're disconnected at this point because of the pandemic. Food security became a big issue. Shelter did too, in fact. So we were looking at ways of saying, well, these are really, really urgent needs that we have right now. And then we had the whole issue of saying, well, the agency itself has to change some of its practices, because now half our people are teleworking. The other half were, preparing food and delivering food and do the essential work that was necessary that couldn't be done virtually. So there were lots of big changes there. And so your question is really, how does that look today in comparison to what we were bringing into our, I guess, with what our experience has been, and what did our experience lead, and let us kind of respond to that. It sounds like in a way, it sounds like, well, we invented the wheel once, and we may want to invent it again. But I had a lot of discussion with our leadership team here about, we expect to walk out of this COVID experience stronger than what we were. And interestingly, this round, I think, we had more opportunity than we did under ARRA. There are more resources. And, there has been, a lot of money put out under different parts of the CARES Act. Csvg came in, and it provided additional money, more money than what we had under ARRA. And so we started thinking about, well, what does that mean? We did, our last strategic plan is updated in 2013 or 14. So we were at a point where we had to rethink that anyway. So again, the stars lined up in terms of saying, we are going to get back into the strategic plan. But we also started thinking about things like, what were the areas that we thought we needed to focus on in relation to coming out of this experience in a stronger position of an organization, while at the same time making sure that all the families we were working with every day were safe, secure, and had adequate shelter. So we obviously tried to tap into every piece of the CARES Act that we can, whether it was rental assistance, or whether it was a shelter, emergency shelter, or whether it was food security. So you had Head Start coming in and saying, well, we're going to let you pay your employees whether your Head Start centers are open or not. But that then allowed us to create virtual classrooms, right? Because we had staff on board, and we were responding to that urgent need. But in terms of where we think the organization wants to go, we started thinking about saying, what we really have to think about now in terms of our next step is, have we learned anything from this teleworking? Is there a new norm that we have to, and how do we in fact fit into an environment where we want to have personal interaction with low-income families, while at the same time being more efficient in the way we can administer benefits and get benefits out the door. And so I don't have answers to this. I'm just saying these are the elements now of our new strategic planning process. We did things like saying, well, so we had these properties. We have these 50 units of houses, single-family, small apartment buildings that we acquired in the 1990s because HUD had asked us to relocate 100 families from a failed HUD project in Garrett County. and we had deadlines. And so we ended up getting these older properties that weren't in the best shape, and we financed them primarily through banks. They weren't capitalized. So now 30 years later, we have to come up with a solution, right? So the response in terms of some of the CSBG CARES money was to say, well, let's use the money not to make minor repairs, but to do capital needs assessment and building evaluations, which positions us for major investment under the tax credit program. That happens maybe next year, not this year. So we are thinking about how we can structure the organization around, for example, transforming some of our assets. We have lots of assets in terms of real estate, for example, and they aren't really producing income. Our goal was to provide low income, affordable housing, and that's what we did. But it's an asset on our books that's not performing in terms of creating a large amount of income. So how can we change that? Do we now create a management company that can generate, can use some of the management fees that from these properties, for example? So part of what we are thinking about now is, the next step and where we are now and what we can do. Communication was a major piece in terms of how we can communicate, not so much within the agency, because we worked on that pretty hard, but how do we improve our communication with our partners, and maybe even within the state structure, state governmental structure, for example. So those are areas that we've focused on in terms of where we're going. I think that the at the same time, when I look at what we've done in terms of responding to the immediate need, we have been able to probably mobilize and leverage more crisis money than we have ever had in our history in terms of responding. But that's because we had the ability to do that. That's the example of we were in a position to do good projects because we had that internal capacity. And this is perhaps a weakness on Garrett County Community Action's part, but over the years, CSBG became the vehicle for supporting our agency infrastructure. No direct services, not programs. But if you look at our history, the history of community action, it was always about creating community change, being a change agent, as you described, and about being a laboratory to test ideas. And if you don't have that chunk or that source of money that allows you to do that, you can't really get it. So we got tied up in using CSBG for what some people may call administrative purposes. I call it agency infrastructure, which was necessary because that's the only way we could keep a viable organization alive, the Community Action Agency. And so when the CARES money came, or the ARRA money came, it was a chunk of money that allowed us to look at that original intent, purpose that came out of OEO, saying you're a change agent, test ideas, look at new needs, look at new ways of doing business, responding. And that was, I think, what happened in this, what is happening today, as a matter of fact, under CARES. And the network was it was so important to allowing that to happen. I mean, the availability of CSBG as it is structured today under CARES has been a godsend in terms of moving forward with this approach. And if that wouldn't have been there, I don't know. It would have been really, really difficult to do anything other than just try to hang on.
Yeah. So again, you have dropped concentrated nuggets of wisdom in what you just said. It was just so much in that, Dwayne. What I heard you say was that the ARRA moment really positioned your agency. So one, it gave you an opportunity to think about CSBG differently, because CSBG is not a program. It's a funding stream that really helps to position or mobilize the community action agency to be a change agent, as you put it. in its community and for its customers. And so for you all in that moment, it gave you an opportunity to do some of that deep capacity building work that really kind of helped your organization to shift or to pivot or to be stabilized in a different kind of way that ultimately enabled you when new opportunities came. Let's say, for example, because now your partners, your stakeholders were starting to see you in a different light as a result of that role that you were playing in ARRA, then over time, as they saw you continue to grow and evolve because your agency had done its organizational or internal work, then more opportunities started to come to the agency. And so more resources, more connections, more opportunities. And when those opportunities came, what I heard you say was then that the organization was ready to take on more and to do more, which ultimately allowed you to show up for your customers and meet those immediate needs while at the same time continuing to think forward and to think ahead in terms of some of those future asset investments that you were making for the community. And so I heard you say related to ARRA, but I also think I heard you say as it relates to now that the organization said, you know, what is it that we can do so that we can come out stronger out of this crisis than the way we started. And so there was some significant movement there. And the other beautiful thing that I think I heard you say was that this time around when the crisis came, you didn't have to call on an external resource. Your leadership team was already asking the question. It's like, okay, here it is again. What can we do? Yeah. And so, were you about to say something?
I just may add, Tiffany. I mean, I think you mentioned it. It was also a situation where, because of the ARRA experience, the community looked toward us. So, you know, we're part of the county's emergency management office, and they have a committee that focuses entirely on what they call the vulnerable population committee. So the minute the governor declared an emergency and shut everything down, that committee was activated. And the first thing the committee did was come to community action and say, one, would you take the lead in responding to food security, offer raising money, donations, going to the community asking for donations, recruiting and assigning volunteers in the community, and in identifying those households, those families, those individuals who are most vulnerable. And when I say identify, I mean address, telephone, contact information, specific contact information. That all actually came about because of a lot of our work on the 2G work, because we've been working with families very, very closely. And so that positioned us to make sure that some of the people almost all the people who we considered to be most vulnerable, where we were making daily contact, where we were getting food to them every day, where we were making sure that they had safe housing. That happened because of our history and because of the capacity that we had in-house. So it wasn't just internal capacity, but it was the way the community looked at us as well. And that's not, I mean, I read, you know, all these news articles, community actions agencies across the country, everywhere, we're doing the same thing. I'm not saying we were even unique in this, but it does demonstrate, I think, how important it is to sustain and think in terms of strategies that allow you to respond, you know, to crises. There'll be another one, you know, inevitably there'll be another crisis.
Yes, hear you loud and clear. And there's a question that has actually come into the chat, Dwayne. So the question is, how would you suggest that an agency make the case to their state CSVG office. If they want to use CSVG for something other than direct financial assistance, and they're getting pushback. And our sense is that this may come up like right now, in terms of CARES, because there have been lots of messages kind of swirling around, but you have a little bit of experience at this. And of course, each state is unique. But again, from your location, given what you know now, what advice would you give your colleagues on the line about how to make a compelling case to utilize their CSBG dollars, their CARES supplemental dollars
Right.
towards some of these big idea innovations?
Well, that's a conversation I think that's happening in with a lot of the CARES money, whether it's CSBG or other, under other umbrellas or under other pathways. But what we tried to do, and we came in, I mean, our CSBG office asked for a plan, a needs assessment, a plan on how you're going to handle the CARES money, the CSBG CARES money. And we tried in Garrett County's situation to frame that conversation, that response around what we thought were what the goals and the purpose of the CSBG were: economic security, family stability, making sure vulnerable populations are protected. And that what we wanted to do was say we wanted to have a built-in capacity so that we could access these other resources to make sure it happened. So the outcome, or the outputs, I guess, in this case, that we talked about were that we were going to use CSBG money to make sure that we can get CDBG money under a rental assistance program, let's say, or that we were going to get the payroll protection plan money that will allow us to keep our employees in place rather than lay them off. And these were all goals that were a part of CSBG. So the frame and the conversation we had with the state office was around the purpose of CSBG and achieving that through these, leveraging other resources and working and mobilizing the community. So that didn't completely answer your question, but that's the way we tried to frame it. And there's a piece of me that says when you see crises like that, you also have to act. You can't just wait for everyone to give you an answer. And sometimes we move forward without having an answer before the answer came. But that question is a question that is asked almost of every one of the CARES programs. And some of the CARES money that we're getting, we do respond to that specifically. So in the case of Maryland, we're getting CDBG rental assistance money, but we have to show that the tenants who get that had a loss of income related to loss COVID directly, and that's documented. That's not something that we had to do with CSBG. We just said that we were going to make sure that we have the ability to respond to that.
Thank you. Thank you. So I want to ask our audience, what questions do you have for Dwayne today? We'll let him take a breath. And if you have a question, we'd love for you to unmute yourself or use the chat window and put your question in the chat, and we would be happy to entertain those questions today. And while you're thinking about your question, audience, Dwayne, you and I have had lots of conversations over the years, to say the least. And, what I didn't tell folks today is because you are a seasoned voice in our network, you and Garrett have functioned as subject matter expert for the partnership as we've done some of this learning communities resource work and really tried to support agencies in various capacities over the years. And you continue to do so at this time. And so, so I'm just sort of making a plug for the fact that, we often remain in close conversation and engage in a lot of co-design together to think about how to support agencies' capacity building efforts. So I'm still waiting for a question. Maybe my question for you is in the conversations that we've had over the years and even recently, you often talk about this notion of building while you're flying. So, like as you talked about the ARRA moment, that seemed to be a moment like that for the organization. And it's safe to say that even right now, the agency in some ways feels like it's sort of building the plane while it's flying the plane. What would you offer as advice to your community action colleagues around um, maybe some best practices or principles or, you know, like how do you do that? What advice would you give for those who want to do that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, advice, I'm looking at the list of participants, and I hate to think of myself as giving advice to some of these veterans and brains that are on this call. But the thing that was important to us anyway was that we didn't want to wait. We had to respond. We couldn't afford to wait. And as long as we had sort of a framework of values, and as long as we had these strategic objectives that we could tie every activity back to, we felt that we could move forward, just really rapidly. And so that was a starting point. And I had a conversation this morning with a colleague from Wisconsin about moving forward on 2G before she became a member of a learning cohort, for example. And our discussion was around, you start now because you learn, and when you are in a situation where you are sharing information with other colleagues around the country, you have something where you've learned something, and you can share information, and the give and take between colleagues is much more meaningful if you've taken those steps immediately. So we've lost. I mean, we've lost money in some cases because we've done that. But at the end of the day, you can't really wait. You can't really hold off. And I think looking back, you can always say, "Oh, I wish we would have done this," or "We wish we would have done that." But if you wouldn't have acted, you wouldn't have even gotten to that question, and you couldn't have even made that kind of a statement. And so we've tried to move forward, and part of it again is that if you have an organization that has a really well-grounded purpose around its mission and its plan, a lot of that will come together as you go along.
Thank you. So you talked a bit about that mission alignment and alignment with the plan, that sort of connecting back to that mission, and really the organization having the courage, as it were, to take the risk, which can be very daunting to say the least for many. Here's a question. How did your financial staff ensure that funding sources were allocated correctly? That's a hot question because that comes up all the time when we're talking about this stuff. What's the word on that?
How does I'm just looking at the chat. How does our finance office do what again, Tiffany? I can't see this question.
So how did your financial staff ensure that funding sources, because there are multiple funding sources that are at work, especially, given the way Garrett is structured with that integrated services and 2G and all that stuff. But how do they ensure that funding sources were allocated correctly?
I get the question, and you're right. That question comes up every time. And it really relates back to the work around integrated services and the idea that all our projects are to support a strategic objective, so they don't have a purpose within themselves. But here's our experience. I mean, I believe, and it's been our experience that a lot of the funders are more open to that question than they ever have. And if you sit down and say, what you want out of this is stable families or stable individuals or a permanent home, and that's the purpose. That's the big picture, the big goal that you want out of it. I found that having a person who is paid by life do an intake that is helping someone getting a rental assistance payment, Section 8 rental assistance payment, has been a conversation that is actually been pretty easy to have. And so we haven't had a lot of issues around that. It's not a perfect world, and there are cases where you have some problems, but Head Start has been really, really good around that question. LIFE has been good around that question. Some of the HUD homeless service programs have been good around that question. And it might be that it's individual circumstances that make that easier, but the answer. So trying to answer the question is that have the conversation and build it around outcomes, not outputs, can sometimes get you through that issue.
Wonderful. So Chongiana from Michigan asked this question. So how has your success been replicated in other areas of your network? Has your state association or other partners played a role in replicating your model? Is the Aspen Institute and others still involved? So it's kind of a three-part for you.
Well, there's a lot of give and take. We're working with community action on our whole family approach. We're working with community action agencies in Virginia and Maryland, and actually all the way. We have community action agencies doing some of this work from Alaska to Maine, and we've been in all those states. But it is not so much that it's a replication of our model. It's more a discussion about our approach and how we want to approach it, and then each of the community action agencies that are develop their own model. I don't see ourselves as having a model that can be, we're not we're not a cookie cutter in terms of saying, well, we're just going to, bake a whole bunch of these cookies and pass them around. But it is an approach, and I really like this idea of having learning communities where there's interaction, where people are giving and taking, and that in itself. We were a part of two cohorts that were organized, well, actually three, one by the Annie Casey Foundation and then the Aspen Institute, and then there was also an effort by USDA to do a rural learning group that the CAP was involved with as well. And I can tell you that was extraordinarily helpful to us. And part of learning, building the airplane while you're flying happens in those environments as well. And I really just think that what the best approach is to get people who have an interest in this to start sharing ideas and setting up platforms, organizing platforms where those ideas can be cultivated, nurtured, and where you can come back and say, this worked, this didn't work. We've been a part of that kind of discussion all over the country, and it's tremendously enjoyable and learning. It's also very educational.
And also, as you have had your cup filled, you continued to pour out to the network. And so, I think the beautiful thing about Garrett is as they've evolved, they've really kind of given us a window in to kind of see what has been going on with them. And as I mentioned at the top of our webinar, through the Learning Communities Resource Center, they have served as subject matter expert for our integrated services learning community group right now as it relates to our whole family approach or two-generation approach portfolio. They really go along with us throughout that portfolio to do that work. We're about to launch a regional whole family approach community of practice, touching 8 states in the Northwest. And Garrett will be working closely with us with that new cohort, as well as some of the ones that he has already mentioned. And so I can't say enough about sort of the impact that they have had, just because of their willingness to engage and, share what they have learned along the way. And they've received so many community action agencies into their doors who, have wanted to engage in conversation, and who are and who were in need of some specific technical assistance. And I'll make a plug, especially as it relates to the the data interoperability piece, and thinking about the use of data and the use of a database and technology system that the organization has kind of been a trailblazer in.
Yeah. Tiffany, thank you for those comments. And I just say, I want to say also that, we've been active in this, and but one of the outcomes that I really feel good about is that in Maryland, for example, every community action agency in the state has decided to implement this approach. And as a result, the state of Maryland governor has created, and the state legislature have created a permanent whole family 2-generation commission. They've appropriated money. The state association has become the leader in Maryland around 2-generation work and whole family work. And so it's led to things that I think will have long-term benefit down the road. And my sense is that the more you can have interaction and share between agencies and colleagues, the more results you're going to see. And that's what we've been trying to just be a part of. I enjoy these conversations because it's all, as I said, it's a learning experience. And so we've made an effort to try to reach out and accommodate interest, just because it helps our situation as well.
Wonderful. So there's some more questions. Some of these look a little more technical. We'll see how we can play these here. And so one is, to help our current programs, we need to receive confirmation that regular Csvg federal poverty level, that federal poverty level increased from 100% to 200% until May 2021. How can we get an official confirmation from the state? Could you share?
Well, you're asking the wrong person how to respond to that question.
Yeah, so it's relative too, based on what.
So if the internal organization structure, the infrastructure, is CSBG supported, does that mean that everyone that we help in that agency has to be under 200%, or whatever the percentage of poverty is that is applicable at that point in time? And we do a lot of first-time home buyers, and so I haven't, I think the issue is your purpose and mission, and that's what you focus on. And if the purpose and mission is to, eliminate poverty, or to move to create community change so that you have vibrant communities, if you're doing work around creating a business, let's say, helping a business start, and you miss out a little bit, we don't apply that test, that income test, to everyone who comes in the door. We apply it to our purpose and mission, but we don't apply it to every individual coming in the door. And that's not an answer, but that's just the way we approach it.
Yeah, and we hear that question, and we'll hold that question more broadly. Maybe if we have a little more time at the end of our conversation today, maybe my colleague Jeannie Chaffin might want to speak to that, but it's kind of loaded. I'll say that. So I don't know how deeply we want to get into that necessarily but we certainly hear you, and it resonates. Dwayne, here's another question. Will your agency place limits on each service category per client under the CARES Act CSVG supplemental funding?
Well, yes, in certain, I mean, when you get into some of the care programs themselves, you have to be compliant. And so in, CSVG, different because we don't treat it as a program or a direct service. But if you're talking about CDBG as a source for your rental assistance, then you have to be compliant with that program, that funder, CDBG, let's just say, if you're going to help a tenant with their rent. So we will be compliant from an eligibility point of view with specific programs. However, having said that, CSBG as a capacity building resource is not something where we'd say everyone in community action has to be, at a certain income.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Any other questions? So we have certainly hit the top of the hour. We had a little more time budgeted for today's conversation so that you would have time to engage Dwayne in some deep conversation. And it has been deep, to say the least. So we'll give you a second to give us any final questions or thoughts. And maybe I'm going to go ahead and give my final question, Dwayne, and maybe see if you want to make your closing remarks. What's the postlude to all of this wonderful wisdom that you've shared with us today? But so here's my question. What resources is Garrett currently calling on to center its leadership in this moment of crisis?
Well, resources is a broad term. And, part of what we are trying to do is to make sure that our leadership here is focused on, I guess, where the community is and where the community needs are. So that's a resource that we are using in terms of saying we want to rely on the community to help us understand what that is. Now, if we're saying, what are all the different buckets of money that are coming down the pathway, that's a little different question. And we're looking at, frankly, we run a transit service, and so CARES provided over $1 million of new unanticipated money for mass transit. This is rural transit. Head Start, as many of us know, has provided additional CARES money. The payroll protection plan was probably the single biggest help that we had in terms of resources. But we're also talking about a lot of different housing money that we weren't getting before that are there. So there are lots of buckets like that. The question is, how can we make sure that we're accessing each of those buckets? Because each of them is specific, and they're intended to respond to a particular need. But having said that, it's a question then of how you bundle those services around what the family aspirations are. So even today, when you have these additional monies, additional resources that are available and that you're able to access, it's still a question of how does that play out with a family, and how you can make each of these tools or each of these buckets support where the family is and where they want to go. So from a sort of an integrated services whole family 2G philosophy, that hasn't changed, even though there's more money and there are more resources. So, Tiffany, I don't know if that's answered your question, but that's kind of the way that's the way I think about it anyway.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I don't see any additional questions. I don't think they have come through. So, Dwayne, I'm going to pull the slides back up. And just to give you a heads up, I'm going to share with everyone the list of publications that Garrett is featured in, because there are quite a few that sort of tell your story and, share some insights from the various stakeholders. Oops, around impact. Let me see if I can get there. So let me get to that slide. All right, so here they are here, and maybe you can even, let me see, make sure that it's showing up the way that we think that it is. Okay, right, so that first bullet that you see there is just the URL for Garrett itself, so you can see their organizational web address. But then there's a publication here, Dwayne, Uplifting the Family, a 2-generation approach. You want to talk about some of these others that are
Well,
here?
actually, I mean, I'm just looking at these things. I don't know I don't know that I can add too much to it. We have, we've been parts of evaluations. We've been, there are a couple community action agencies that were a part of all this work. For instance, Cap Tulsa in Tulsa, Oklahoma, is one of the leaders, and so I'm just looking at some of this. These are what you see here, and you'll get different parts of our history. For instance, the James Bell Associates was an evaluation done on 2G that involved a couple different 2G agent organizations, and that was done early. That was one way back. I don't know, about 2017 or 16, I think. So I just say that these all it makes more sense to do these sequentially in terms of learning anything, I guess. But you would get some stuff that was looked at early on when we were first starting. And I don't know, Tiffany, I can, I some of these I'm not even sure what was in some of these reports. And as you can see, the Casey Foundation did a lot of these, but we also were very involved with the Aspen Institute. We were the National Association of Counties was doing a report on some of our work that was funded through the Gates Foundation, and we had so we were doing some work with a group of county executives, really from all over the country. Around that, we had a visit that really was fruitful, I thought, with legislative staff people in about 2 years ago, again supported by the Gates Foundation. So yeah, I think it was very useful just to get Community Action's name out there with some of these national groups that are interested in this. And I think maybe the key thing is that there's a lot of interest in this whole family integrated services 2G work. And right now, Community Action Agencies, the network, is, I think, in a lead position around that.
Yeah, and we're in a lead position because of work that your organization has done. It's been groundbreaking. And then you believe in that notion that charity begins at home, because for some organizations, some CAAs even, it's like they kind of make the spotlight and then they leave the rest of the network behind. But that's not who Garrett is. And so Garrett, as you've already said, has influenced its peers within its own state. And Angela Martin, who is the executive director of the Maryland Community Action Partnership, is on the line. So Dwayne and his team have worked very closely with Angela and her team, and Stuart, who is in the state office, to really offer a transformative opportunity for their entire state. And then, as I've already articulated, they have played a crucial role in our national efforts in this space as well. And so the resources, really the slide deck that is here, It captures the highlights of what Dwayne talked about today in a broad sense, and these resources are available. All of these resources have been curated or collected by the National Community Action Partnership and are available in our tools and resources library. So you can access all those resources there. I will make another mention of our Community Action Economic Mobility Initiative, where there are tons of resources that we have developed and webinars and just other information. And again, Garrett and its wisdom has sort of fit, not sort of, has fed in to that effort. And my wonderful colleague, Jeannie Chaffin, who is on the line today, has really helped to bring that work into focus in a way that makes it replicable and scalable for our network. So again, Dwayne, thank you so much for sharing with us today. Thanks to everyone for joining today's conversation. As we wrap up, we would like to point to some future Webinar Wednesday events that are coming up in October. Please save the date for a webinar focused on it's focused on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So it's an opportunity for organizations to find out more on how to get resources into the hands of your customers, especially as it relates to certain initiatives through our government as a result of CARES as well. So stay tuned for more details about that important event. Additionally, want to point out for folks that the Partnerships Management, Leadership, and Training Conference will take place February 3rd through 5th, 2021. So more details related to MLTC are forthcoming. So hopefully you will be able to join us for that event. Again, today's webinar and conversation is being supported through resources and investments from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services through a cooperative agreement with the Office of Community Services for the Learning Communities Resource Center. And again, as I've said, Garrett and Dwayne has served as our subject matter expert for that project this past year. And into this year, we got news today that we got funded for the new cooperative agreement for the next 3 years. So we're excited about that as well. So there are just so many opportunities that the partnership has. And for those of you who are listening today, we hope that you would take advantage of those through the resources we have on our website, or if there are needs for technical assistance or interest in joining some of our upcoming learning community groups or cohorts, we would strongly, strongly encourage you to take the journey with us. At this time, Dwayne, thank you again. To everybody here, thank you for all that you do on the ground to touch and change people's lives. It's so important work, and we so appreciate what you do. And our hope is that what we offer today has inspired you and given you some new energy and new ideas about how to show up more effectively for your people, our people. This concludes today's webinar. Make it a great day. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to play us out with the community action song as folks are signing off. Well, thank you. Community action. to you.